Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I'm the principal attorney at the firm. Today's review, we're going to be looking at cookies. So cookies are considered personal data because the definition of personal data is any information that identifies an individual. So let's walk through the cookie consent flow. Firstly, we've got the banner. We value your privacy. We and our third-party partners may use cookies, which I've already identified constitute personal data, and similar technologies on this site to analyze usage, optimize our service, personalize content, tailor and measure ads, and keep this site secure. So they've got a privacy notice and they've got a cookie notice. Now we're going to customize. So essentially the language that we just read in the banner should be consistent with what we read, not just in the preference center, but also in our ability to exercise our rights as consumers. And I'm a consumer of this site because on that banner it said, oh, this is for those who use our website, and I'm using the website. So I'm going to exercise my rights. Now, one thing I think is very interesting is we've got functional cookies on and required cookies. Now, traditionally with these preference centers, you'll see that it'll be the required cookies that allow the site to function. What's interesting is the language in the banner had also outlined other things like performance, but we've only got 3 sections here: functional, required, and advertising. My personal preference as a practitioner is any disclaimers that are listed in the banner that we saw before should also be reflected here. So if we say we're going to use performance cookies, we should have a button that says performance cookies, right? We do have the advertising, required, and functional, but as I recall from the banner, there were additional insights that had been listed that aren't here. Okay, let's look. Cookies are small bits of data stored on the device that you use to access any of our websites, right? I'm using the website right now, so this is happening. Functional cookies are being collected on me as are required, so we can recognize repeat users. So this fulfills the definition of personal data, right? Because it identifies a user. I'm a user, Funmi Owolabi, and I've logged onto this site. And as I've logged onto this site, functional cookies and required cookies are stored on my device to identify me. Each cookie expires after a certain period depending on what we use it for. Now, this is really valuable because one of the tenets of privacy law is that data should not be retained indefinitely, right? We've got to have a purpose for the data, and that purpose, once it ends, we delete the data. So this is really valuable. In our cookie notice, we use the word cookies as a catch-all term to include not only cookies, but other technology such as pixels, web beacons, and page tags. I want to highlight this. This is really important because as long as an identifier, as long as there is like a piece of data that can identify you, it constitutes personal data. Now, on its face, if you looked at a pixel, you might not consider a pixel to be personal data, but because it identifies me, it constitutes personal data under the data protection law, and businesses have to adhere to what is required under the data protection laws when they process this type of information. Now, the other reason I wanted to highlight this is very geography dependent. If you look specifically at California privacy legislation, there's legislation that explicitly references pixels, web beacons, page tags, and other tracking technologies. And you can see that that legislation is applicable in California, but in other states may not be that restriction. So again, geography matters, and I've mentioned this in pretty much every single review I've ever done. So we've got the advertising cookies that are on, right? I want to explain why this is on. And next time I do a cookie review, my plan is to put a VPN on and we can review this site as though we're in the European Union, because that matters. I've talked about geography. This was turned on for me. So I am located in the United States, right? And in the United States, the obligations for businesses when it comes to cookies is to provide users the opportunity to opt out, meaning we can be opted in as US residents to any cookies that a business wants to obtain on us, but businesses have to give us the opportunity to opt out. Now, in the European Union, the requirement is to opt in. Anything that's not required has to be an opt-in from the European Union residents' perspective. So this button, this toggle should be off if we're accessing the site in the European Union. But as far as we're concerned from a US perspective, this is accurate. I've turned it off. I'm going to confirm my choices and we can go ahead. So we can see the word geography has been listed. I talked about this in every single audit. It's very important, which gives me an inclination that perhaps it's possible that the preference center that is presented in other geographies based on what the data protection law requires there is going to be different to what we've just experienced in this review. This was last updated December 27, 2025, so it's been reviewed in the last few months. There's a description of what cookies are. I think descriptions are really useful. I've talked about this in pretty much I would say half the audits that I've done. The reason why a definition is so important for businesses is because your audience, the audience of individuals who are likely to encounter this cookie notice, are not familiar with the nuances related to personal data. And most, if not all, consumers, like let's say, for example, someone like my father, if I told my father that a cookie was personal data, he wouldn't understand what this is. I mean, he works in the tech space, but most consumers don't work in the tech space, and most consumers are not privacy lawyers. So most consumers of the website are not going to know what a cookie is, which is why it's very important to explain what it is for your audience. What cookies do we use? Our sites and services use both first-party cookies, again, we've got another definition, and third-party cookies, which are set by a server located outside the domain. The other thing I want to talk about for this particular audit is the fact that the cookie flow that we just conducted prior to the review of this notice forms a part of your cookie compliance with respect to your privacy program. It's not good enough for a business to just draft a notice. You need to follow the cookie consent flow and have a cookie consent mechanism for you to be able to fulfill your obligations under the data protection laws in the geographies where you're required. I think that's a really important nuance that businesses should become more aware of. I will say that I've seen, especially in 2026, I've seen more related to cookie banners and preference centers. But I think it's important to understand that not only is the banner important, the preference center is important, and then the notice. And the applicability of the preference center and how it works in practice is important from a geography standpoint, and you need to take that into consideration depending on where your products and solutions are offered. Because as I mentioned, I'm a US resident, so the preference center that I view is going to be different to an EU resident. And when we're looking at regulator perspective, if you are a global organization, you've got regulators in all those geographies that are looking out for specific compliance in adherence to the laws in their geography. A US regulator is going to be looking out for cookie compliance in the United States. A European Union regulator is going to be looking out for cookie compliance from a EU perspective. You've got to adhere to both if you provide your products and services and meet the thresholds of the privacy laws there. And that's why for a lot of these cookie audits, I've been looking at the preference center. We don't always do it because sometimes there's so much detail that could be added to the notice. But I think it's really valuable to know that when you as a business are continuing in your journey on maintaining and optimizing your privacy program. So I really hope you enjoyed this particular review. If you have comments about what I've stated, leave a comment below and I'll see you in another review.